Breaking news coming in. The GST reform is on track as the group of ministers on GST rate rationalization accepted the centre's proposal to move a two-slab structure of 5 and 18%. The new rate slabs will be 5% for merit goods and services and 18% for standard items. And moving on now, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar said that India was not the biggest importer of Russian oil and expressed that he was perplexed as New Delhi's purchase of oil from the US had in fact increased. The statements came in as Donald Trump has been putting pressure on India to stop buying oil from Moscow, claiming that the move was fueling Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Speaking at bilateral meeting with Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov in Moscow, Jaishankar said that we are not the biggest purchaser of Russian oil, that is China. We are not the biggest purchasers of LNG, that is European Union. We are not the biggest trade surge, and we've not seen the biggest trade surge with Russia since 2022, and I think these are some countries to the south.
We are not the biggest purchasers of Russian oil, that is China. We are not the biggest purchasers of Russian LNG. I'm not sure, but I think that is the European Union. We are not the country which has the biggest trade surge with Russia after 2022. I think there are some countries to the south. We are a country where actually the Americans said for the last few years that we should do everything to stabilize the world energy markets, including buying oil from Russia. Incidentally, we also buy oil from America, and that amount has been increasing. So, quite honestly, we are very perplexed at the logic of the argument that you had referred to.
Is the External Affairs Minister saying we are perplexed as far as the clarity on trade and oil deal with Russia is concerned, clarifying what we already know, that India is not the biggest purchaser of Russian oil. My colleague Kartik Malhotra joining us from the newsroom. Kartik, External Affairs Minister essentially saying what's been out there for the longest time. India is not the biggest purchaser of Russian oil, and it is China. And as far as US's import policies on China is concerned, they've been extremely lenient with China, giving it at least 90-day period.
You're right, Shweta, and in fact, I think we saw that External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar there responding to a media question, potentially a question from somebody from the media really asking him in the context of presumably the additional secondary tariffs which are likely to be imposed on India on the 27th of this month. However, if you remember during the Alaska summit where you had that camaraderie visible at least between US President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin, there was some reporting which suggested that perhaps India may not be slapped with those secondary tariffs after all. But no denying the numbers. I think there is nothing really, no rocket science in the numbers there, which very clearly tell you that China is indeed the largest importer of Russian oil. India is number 2. In percentage terms, China imports a lot more oil for its own domestic use. So in percentage terms, the amount of oil that China purchases from Russia is in the range of about 15 to 18%. But that in the case of India is about 35 to 38%. But that is just the sheer volume that China imports as opposed to what India imports. But from as far as the total volume of oil that is purchased from Russia, China is the #1 importer, and there is absolutely no news in that. So, honestly, a little strange that a question like that would be asked to the External Affairs Minister when he's on foreign soil.
I think it's also, clarifying on the misinformation that is out there as far as US is concerned vis-a-vis India-Russia ties. So far, we've only seen India being penalized with secondary tariffs. There's been no tariff on European Union. There is absolutely no conversation of additional tariff on China. So India seems to be the only country that is being penalized. But, and you mentioned Alaska summit. I think more clarity also came in from Donald Trump with respect to tariffs on India and China, where he said that if conversations were to progress and peace were to prevail with Ukraine, perhaps he will relook at those additional tariffs of 25%. So, Kartik, no clarity on whether 27th of August those additional tariffs will come in or not.
You're right. In fact, no update on that, if I can put it that way. I think Donald Trump was pretty clear when he announced the tariffs, but he's gone silent since then. But you mentioned the Alaska summit. In fact, after the Alaska summit, you also had Zelensky and the other European leaders visiting Washington, and there was a meeting in the White House. And again, I think the next step for that is this trilateral meeting expected between Donald Trump, Zelensky, as well as Putin, and that could perhaps pave the way for potentially a ceasefire and peace thereafter. But until then, I think, there isn't really any surety on which way August 27th is going to turn when it comes to secondary tariffs on India. But I think the other point that Dr. S. Jaishankar was making is also a pertinent one, and that is the fact that that we haven't really seen a sizable increase in trade, with Russia since 2022, and that is again something where he's also mentioning that our oil import from US is also increasing. We don't know what those numbers are, but we are made to understand that there is some increase in India buying oil from from US as well. So obviously India trying to also balance out this large ego of US President Donald Trump, and at the same time what we've been saying, protecting our own economic interests. So I think Dr. S. Jaishankar there just clarifying India's position, which has been fairly firm, that India needs to protect its economic interests. And in fact, ever since those secondary tariff threats were issued on India, India and Russia have also started working closer together. In fact, the terms of reference have already been signed, and potentially a roadmap for FTA should follow soon. And that includes, among other Eurasian countries, of course, Russia. So we are also at some point stating our discomfort with US President Donald Trump and his administration. In fact, just yesterday, Scott Bessent had also gone on an interview, if I'm not mistaken, on Fox News, again stating the administration's displeasure at India continuing to import Russian oil, and also not mincing their words in quoting that India is funding the war economy of Russia. So I think India again making its point very clear, and also some sort of, if I may put it, some sort of a defiance against the US administration by saying that here we are signing terms of reference with Russia and the Eurasian region, and we are looking at increasing our trade with that bloc as well.